this is where I'm going to begin. Who am I and where am I coming from with all my ideas? So I wanted to tell you that I was born and raised in a very poor city in the north of England called Liverpool. Some of you may have heard of it. It's perhaps famous for the Beatles. Maybe it's also famous for football. It's also famous for its sense of humour, but I guess you'll have to believe me on that one. And as I mentioned already, it's also famous for poverty. Anyway, I was raised there in the 70s and 80s, in a time, I think, where people observed class distinctions and divisions quite firmly. And I remember talking to my grandparents about wanting to follow my older brother to go to university. And my grandparents said, you know, university, it's not for girls, and it's certainly not for girls from the working classes. What they said to me instead, and this is a photograph of Liverpool in that time, which was a very poor, rundown place. They told me instead that I should know my place within the class system and to live within it, not to question authority, not to do things differently, but just to stick with that. They told me that working in a shop was good work for girls. And then they told me to get in the kitchen and do the dishes or something. And I guess that actually I've been taking their missive to know my place seriously, literally ever since. Know my place, care for it, cherish it. But of course, this is the place that I mean, this wonderful earth home. It's all of our place, of course, and it's in a very precarious state. I'm sure you'll be familiar with a lot of the language around the planetary boundaries models and other things, but there, Earth is described at this point as a planet on the edge. So, okay, a planet on the edge is where we're going to begin. And now we're going to step lightly but firmly into the fashion context. So what I'm going to talk to you about is lots of different ideas or stories about how to make change happen, but they all begin from a similar sort of place, an understanding or a modeling of the fashion industry as an interconnected, complex system. And what feels critical about seeing it that way is that we see that all of the parts are critical to the functioning of the whole, as is the context. And we need to understand this complex global system as a whole system and try to tackle change at that level, as well as at a smaller level of change at the same time. So this sounds quite daunting, but I'm going to give a go at explaining what I mean now. So there's so many different ways that we can engage with change, but thinking about how much change is delivered by different tactics and different techniques is one way maybe to think about that. And a bit like the iceberg, the understanding that only part of which, a small part of which is visible and commonly engaged with as a notion of what an iceberg is, most of it is unseen and unknown to us. Somebody who really helped us understand about these different ways to engage with change and what that means is the visionary systems thinker, Donella Meadows. So she developed this list that's in front of you here. We were thinking about different types of change and how that we can begin to affect change in different ways. And so we were drawing upon the iceberg, this idea that only some of the change that we can imagine are we engaging with, and that yet there's a lot more potential that perhaps is untapped or not yet known about. So in this regard, one of the things that is a really powerful source of structure and inspiration for thinking about how to make change happen, how to tweak or push a system towards a different set of parameters or structures or qualities, is the systems thinker, Donella Meadows. So she penned this list in the 1990s. And there's many things when you look about it, you think, what's going on here? But one of the things that she suggested by drawing up a list like this is she gave us, I suppose, a place of leverage points about how you can begin to affect a complex system like the fashion industry. The way she organized the list is interesting in itself. So she starts at the top with efficiencies and then material stocks and flows. Oh, I've got quite an echo. Can you, anyway, maybe I'll just carry on. Efficiencies and material stocks and flows. And yet she numbers this 9 on the list. So she organizes the list in this way, with each line on the list, each having more potential to affect change than the one before. So the first thing on the list is the place that we're the most likely to start, but it's the place that brings the least benefit. And this was sort of behind her thinking about this. She was trying to show us the counterintuitive way that many of us begin to think about change. We tend to start with the small things. We tend to tinker with the things that we think are within our control and hope that they're going to deliver big change. But what Donella Meadows' list does is it actually takes our attention away from the small things exclusively, actually towards the big questions, which are down at the bottom of the list. It's number 1, the thing that we should be prioritizing, and number 2, also the things that if we start there, we're going to deliver big change. So she encouraged us to think about the mindset, the purpose of a system, and ask, is that really what we want? Think about the goals of the system and maybe imagining how we can change those as the way to bring the biggest change. So, yet it's still a bit daunting, a bit unclear about how we can start oftentimes. And so one of the things that you do when, or maybe I do, I'm sure you probably do it too, is when you don't really know where to begin, you ask someone for advice. And this is the American poet called Gary Snyder. And he offers some advice about when you don't really know what it is that you're doing, how to start, where do I begin? He suggests that we do 2 things. The first is that we build deep knowledge of where we are now and all of the conditions of the system that we're in. And for us, actually, that requires that we deeply acknowledge fashion's shared biography with consumerism and with modernism. And then the second thing is we begin to stray. Once we've learned what we know about what fashion is, then we begin to stray outside of that understanding and take risks and do things differently. And that's where change can come. So in today's talk, I'm just going to both explore number 1, digging into what it is about the dynamics of where we are now, and the second about straying, taking a journey that takes you into surprising places, unknown places, and perhaps brings difficulty with it along the way, and also good stuff, of course. Okay, so the first thing, and here I suppose what I'm talking out of is a position that is common within the global north, but I will share it because this perhaps is the place that we need to affect change most, in and around the global north view of what fashion is, engaging with it, consumer society, and high levels of consumption. So what is the dynamics of the thing that we're currently in? Well, fashion certainly is perhaps predominantly experienced as an engine of consumerism. and that the language and the expression of the consumer society in the clothes that we buy, in the clothes that we wear, in the clothes that we make is so overriding, I think, that we hardly even notice it. Purchase and disposal is actually sort of seen as a necessary component for engaging in contemporary culture. And many ideas of progress have become tied to a societal narrative of growth through buying more garments. Fashion, of course, cut in the cloth of consumerism, has been supported by different approaches to production and manufacture that have been shaped by these sorts of pursuits and purposes. The market domination of clothing production and consumption has actually changed the fashion industry. If you look over the last 100 years, you'll see so profoundly changed the sector is on the back of these priorities around growth. What we also see is that the ideology of more and cheaper now has begun to completely transform the sense of day-to-day consumption patterns. Cheap garments have changed how much people buy. In the first decade of the 21st century, in Europe, for instance, clothing prices fell by 26%. And in the US in that same time by almost 18%. So these have also altered the high street, the shopping malls, the places where we go to buy clothes. What we now see is that obsolescence and premature replacing of products before they've been worn out is now completely normal. This is sort of possible because of a political ideology which is very closely bound to consumerism. Shopping is presented as a democratic choice. It's a political project that integrates economic and personal freedoms. And at the same time, manufacturing systems and technological innovation have also converged, and they've set up standardized, high volume, low cost production. So these sorts of things begin to dictate the nature of dressing. We all buy low cost clothes and we buy them in bulk. And then the fashion industry goes on to measure its own success in how much people buy. And this then shapes the way we dress. We get caught in a cycle. So this whole approach then draws into the market the types of businesses that thrive in these conditions. And all of the solutions that are proposed to pretty much any problem that is presented to the fashion industry all look a bit the same. The dominant model assumes the preference for consumerist fashion, and all solutions end up shaped like clothing, pretty much as it has done over the last 20 to 50 years. Unfortunately, this same story of all solutions looking a bit the same, all of them are clothing products, is the same for sustainability. This sort of focus on products as the solution and materials often as the solution to sustainability issues, it sort of assumes that there's a preferred type of fix for problems. But actually what we see is that buying ready-made clothes is a very limited interface through which to interact with the world of appearances. Some of the things that we know is that fashion profoundly contributes to the creeping global mega crisis of sustainability. And since the 1990s, there really have been huge efforts to reduce the negative effects. And I'm sure those of you in the room today are part of that move. And I feel like I have been part of that move really since the early 1990s. So one of the things that we've largely been doing in this time, the last 30 years, is that we've been pursuing efficiencies. We've been trying to make fibers, lower impact. We've been introducing new chemical processes, technical improvements in terms of water, energy use, for instance, chemicals use also. We've been investing in supply chain initiatives, in transparency, in recycling, in upcycling. You get the picture. And it's true, and it's a hopeful message, I think, that in this time, if you measured the impact for every garment produced, this has been going down. So it's a good news story to some extent, in that the impact of each individual garment is slightly less than it was 20 to 40 years ago. And yet, and this is less hopeful, I'm afraid, in that same time, because the system that all of these garments, all of these clothing items are being produced within is optimized for growth, these growth figures that shape the whole of the industry as a whole, they completely overshadow any of the small efficiency gains that we've been delivering. What we know is that efficiency gains don't mean much in a system that's growing massively year on year. They're just not strong enough. They don't reach deep enough to affect change substantially. What we know is that the impact of the sector, despite all our best efforts over the last 30 years, is increasing, not reducing. And all of the attempts that we have made to lessen the impact of the fashion sector have been completely eroded by the increase in the number of garments in circulation worldwide. So what we see, whatever we've been doing, we've been overseeing a situation which has been really getting worse, not better. What this perhaps indicates more than anything is that our best intentions come up against the structures of unsustainability. And as we begin to try to figure out how to make changes, we need to see things perhaps in a different way. I think it's the case that the current approaches that we've been dealing with are all too similar to each other. They're too simple often, they're too neat, often they're not human scale, they're industry scale or global scale in a way that people can't relate to. And then they don't recognize the interconnected forces that influence the system as a whole. And this has led us into a very precarious position where 3 of the planetary boundaries that were identified by the Stockholm Resilience Centre in 2009, 3 of these planetary boundaries have already been transgressed. And this leaves us in a very precarious state, in a state where we are beginning to feel concerned, seriously concerned about the future. So in the fashion context, perhaps the imperative here is to begin to shift. If the things that we've been doing haven't been working to affect change, we need to affect some sort of shift. And I would suggest that one of those ways to shift what we're doing is to begin to open ourselves up to questions, not only about what we're dressing in, what we're making, but also to questions about how. And this then shifts the agenda from maybe a materials agenda to one that is much more broad, much more about culture, much more that looks more broadly into the bigger questions. Most profoundly, I think that we are beginning to understand that sustainability is a political challenge, not just a technical challenge. We already have many of the technologies that we need in order to transform our societies, our economies, but we don't have the skills and we're not able to bring people with us on this journey. So this is the imperative for us all, is to begin to recognize that we have to work with more than the material flows, the technical details of what it means to imagine, create, construct, produce, sell product. We have to do something also different to that. Okay, so that's the end of point 1, digging into our current conditions. And this is point 2. This is my favorite bit, perhaps you could imagine. This is about straying. This is about taking a risk, taking a chance, traveling a route that was not originally intended, so that we move outside a limited area. When we stray, we begin to engage fashion and sustainability in many different ways, forms, and types. There are other practices, different ways of knowing, other ideas, networks, collaborations, vocabulary. Suddenly we're thinking and acting completely differently. Generally, this is different to the story that's told. This is different to the story that's mobilized. Maybe one of the things that we can talk about is the similarities and differences with what I'm saying to what you've heard today, because I'm sure there'll be quite a lot of overlap and also maybe some other distinctions. I'm now going to talk about a couple of projects that I've done that maybe open up this space of acting and doing and thinking and being in different ways. The first was a project which was called The Craft of Use, and it was predominantly a research project. It started from a very simple what if question. And the question is, what if we gave as much attention to tending and caring and maintaining and wearing clothes as to creating them? What if we prized usership as much as ownership? What would happen both to us and to everything else? And I guess behind this project was the realization that the fashion sector in the global north cannot continue to grow. And so we need to begin to imagine what fashion provision and experience can be like beyond consumerism. And I guess by focusing on use as some sort of craft, the skills, the refined practices, the attention to detail, by focusing on it in that way, we begin maybe to open ourselves up to the compelling possibilities and practicalities for fashion, mainly within the clothes that we already have. I guess one of the things that you realize when you think about what people do when they use their clothing is that you see that using clothing isn't dependent on producing and consuming more. Actually, where it takes its bearings from is from the skills, practices, and ideas of wearing clothes in real life. It's not, of course, that using garments doesn't consume resources, because it does, a few, but actually it's more that the most important thing is it's not driven by the politics and the practices of growth economics. And this feels like the big shift. I should have been clicking through these slides, sorry. So one of the things that I realized in this project very quickly is that there's loads of really valuable things that happen with clothing outside of the very narrow terms of reference of the market. And if we can begin to find a way to open up to lots of different ways of valuable activity, then fashion can become much more diverse, and people's experience of it can also become more diverse. In this project, there were loads and loads and loads of different stories that were shared. I interviewed more than 500 members of the public from high consuming nations around the world to ask them to begin to open up the possibility of thinking about what beyond growth might mean, post growth might mean. And there are a couple of stories. This one, for instance, is the place that I live in the north of England. This man was in his 80s when he brought this sort of waistcoat cardigan thing along, and he said that it had been through 3 iterations in its life with him. It started out as a narrow fitting waistcoat, but then he put some weight on and couldn't fasten it up the front any longer. So he just took out his knitting needles and knitted this sort of panel that you can see in the back, and inserted it, slit the waistcoat up the back with a pair of scissors and inserted this knitted panel. And then a few years later, he thought, you know what this needs? This needs some sleeves. So he knitted a pair of sleeves and a waistband and a collar. And then some years later, he put some more weight on and decided actually what this needed to have was some like leather latchets across the front, which then would enable him to close it when it was with a bigger tummy. So I guess what a story like this shows is it shows that these sorts of skills are the skills of a rich and confident society. They tell us that we can act differently and can act differently. I mean, this man wasn't a tailor. Other stories that came along were just regular items like this jumper that had been brought into one of the photo shoots in London. It was an old item, and the guy that was wearing it said, you know, it wasn't like from an eco brand or anything, but I've just worn it for so long that I've sort of changed the values of the brand just by keeping and holding on to it. I forced them into being more eco-friendly. And I thought, this is an example that you don't need to get out your sewing kit and your needle and thread to make a change. You can sort of make a change by conceiving of your garments differently in your mind. And this is a dress worn by an elderly woman who was gifted this dress in the 1960s. And these are her 3 daughters and 2 granddaughters, all who competitively try to wear the same dress. One of the most important things I think maybe this shows is that garments, clothing is really influenced by what goes on beyond design and production. And that what happens in terms of sustainability impacts is really shaped by this world beyond production. And so we need to begin to figure out ways to work more collaboratively, open up to fashion as some sort of shared enterprise. Not, I mean, here with workers, although workers creating the clothes are definitely part of this, but the people, all of us who wear clothes, seeing this as a much more open project for fashion, because up to this day, fashion has been really closed to that. We need to try to find a way that acknowledges the contributions of users in a different way and to hold that centrally. I suppose the point that I'm getting to is we can begin to transform things beyond the sort of material that we specify or how we stitch a seam, but in other different ways. So we're moving from trying to shift from concentration from things to ideas, to stories, to actions and skills. Another one of the projects that I just want to briefly talk about is a project that is engaging with local fashion, ideas of reorganizing how we do things on a much more regional and community basis. So this project that I did was called Fashion Ecologies. Its starting point, I think, was that where you are can become an invitation to begin to affect sustainability change. Recognizing place as a powerful way to affect change is really vital. I think another one of the things that feels really important is that when we work locally, we affect things on a very political level quite quickly. What happens when things and power is given to local communities? People feel they have much more influence over decisions that affect their lives. They also can see the effects of their decisions and then make changes around that. What happens when we work locally is that generally the benefits of what we do get re-centered and redirected back into the heart of community, Whereas in the globalized model of fashion, all of these benefits are stripped away very quickly, sucked away to some sort of head office somewhere, we don't know where, because actually location is unimportant, I guess, in internationalist organizations of the worst sort. So engaging with this sort of local agenda and local power feels like a really important way forward. And I guess maybe the point here is that when you work locally, really rooted in place, when you are recognizing the local adaptations that come maybe from weather, from skills, from the sort of tastes that people have locally, the flavors locally, that things can begin to be really different. One of the things that happened from the field work in this project is that very quickly we saw that much of the stuff that was happening was effectively like underground, like a subterranean network, a bit like this root system that you can see on this slide, almost like a subterranean network of activity. And what happened in this underground network, which happened in people's homes, in between families and community groups, in all of these non-formal economy places, all of this underground activity helped or enabled the formal economy activity to run. And I mean, maybe that's fine that it's organized like that, but what very quickly became apparent is that actually no one advocates for what happens underground. And yet when what happens underground is gone, the formal activity falls for we don't know what reason. And I think it's because of that. So this project saw lots of little projects that I did inputting, for instance, repair, clothing repair tools in laundrettes, producing a map and engaging people to walk in the local town differently, away from the high street and towards other textile features and places. The part of England that I live in is where the Industrial Revolution happened, and so we have a lot of textile history here, and it was trying to engage people in doing that in different ways. I also produced a pocket guide to what fashion ecology is and might be, and that's free to download. Famously, ecology, the science of ecology, looks at the relationships between things and place. So it's all about relationships. So fashion ecology is all about the relationships of fashion to people and to place, really building a sense of interconnected understanding on the back of that. And then the last project that I'm going to share with you today is a project that is still ongoing, still live, called Earth Logic. This is a project that I do together with my longtime collaborator, Matilda Tam. So Earth Logic, which has got a subtitle of Fashion Action Research Plan, is free to download from the Earth Logic website. So please, if you've not seen it, you're welcome to engage with it if you wish. So it was first released in 2019. And the idea behind it was, and the purpose of naming it specifically Earth Logic, was to try to shift the conversation and maybe to call out, first of all, perhaps it was to call out the role that economic growth plays, the logic of growth economics plays in limiting the possibility for change within fashion. And we thought, well, we need to replace this pursuit of growth at all costs, this logic of growth at all costs, with a different logic, with the logic of Earth and with the health of the Earth and all its people as the priority. And as we were producing the Earth Logic work, what we began to see was that from different paradigms, different understandings and possibilities begin to flow. So we changed the paradigm by shifting from a growth logic paradigm to this new paradigm that was centered on health of the Earth and all of its people. And then we saw entirely different systems, products, processes, and relationships open up for fashion. So some of the ideas behind this are simply like you can imagine, and this is maybe repeating what I said within the Donella Meadows list of places to intervene in a system. But the place that most people start is the smaller oval at the bottom, focusing on products, trying to change products, their technologies, their processes. But these benefits are worthwhile, but they will always be limited by the bigger system that the products are operating in. And if this bigger system's values and priorities are set to continuous growth, any gains that are possible at the product level and even at the systems level of business model changes, these will not reduce environmental impacts. And in fact, they will also lead to an increase in social injustice. So instead, what we have to do is to work with culture and mindset. And that's actually what Earth Logic tries to do. It's to change the culture and mindset, because if you change here, you can determine the effectiveness of all of the other interventions that you make. So Earth Logic has three parts to it. It has a set of values, or a values explicit context that we try to lead with as we go through. And a really key one of those is care. It also has a research checklist in it with a whole list of things that we encourage people to try to leave behind if they're going to move forward in an Earth Logic way and try to keep their work in a radical space. And there's many different ways of thinking that the growth logic mindset has given us, and maybe it's hard to disengage from them. And some of them perhaps are that technology is going to fix this all, and we just rely on technology. And actually, we're just going to have to, that's not true. We're going to have to do the work, and we need to leave behind that belief that technology is going to resolve this. The other idea is often that someone else, somewhere else on the world, will do this. But actually, it's up to us all of you here and me, to collectively do this together. So the third part of Earth Logic has 6 landscapes, as we call them. These are places that we can do work, root ourselves, land. They're sort of domains that we can begin to find opportunities for doing things differently. And these 3 are local, less, and plural. And importantly, this push for less, which is critical, as I've been sort of alluding to, that we can't continue to grow. But this really needs to be tempered by a realization that this can only happen if we're engaging with questions around social justice at the same time. It's not less for all, it's less for those who've been engaging with extreme levels of consumption, predominantly in the global north. And then the last 3 Earth Logic landscapes are all about taking action, and these include learning, languaging, governance, and you can find out more about these with Earth Logic in the Earth Logic report. So Earth Logic has been remarkably successful. More than 1 million people have been engaging with it. It's now available or been translated into 4 languages. And we've done loads of different things, workshops, lots of other things. And then more recently, in fact, just out last week, is a new piece of work called Earth Logic Gardening, which is also free to download from the Earth Logic website. And maybe you'll be some of our first readers if you download it. So Earth Logic Gardening is a practical guide to cultivating change, social change, ecological change, cultural change, and economic change. And the starting point here, I think, was that we all know, I think, that the sort of how we do something is vital. You can't, I mean, Einstein famously said that we can't change the problems with the same type of thinking that created them. So if we start from that as a premise, that we realize that we can't foster ecological, social, cultural change with the sort of thinking that we borrow from growth logic processes, we actually have to do change in a different way. And when Matilda and I were imagining, well, what would this change be like in an earth logic context? We began to think to the age-old practices of gardening, this process of cultivating the soil, the ground beneath our feet, the living earth, working with whatever conditions are around you, knowing who your collaborators are locally, and beginning to root and recognize and respond to change. Think about the tools that you need, keeping them sharp, changing them up, all this sort of thing. And then also, of course, recognizing the importance of taking good rest. Fallowing, of course, is a critical part of gardening. So that's where we are today. Look forward to hearing your thoughts on that one. And with that, I'm going to stop there and hopefully engage in a good discussion. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Kate. That was really incredible presentation and just like took us through your work in such a meaningful way. I'm going to open up to the floor. If anybody has anything to ask or comment on? Yeah, just is it my phone? Can you hear it? Oh wait, hold on.
Hello, can you hear me, Kate?
Okay, cool.
Hi, Kate. My name is Keith. Thank you for your presentation. It was very informative. I don't think this is a question. It's more of like, I guess, something I'd like to get your thoughts on. But with the call of this change that should be done within with a sustainable fashion that can help with climate change and all sorts of things, but like, is the responsibility more on the big corporations or is it on the consumer? Because I guess as a consumer, you know, we take these products and I guess we interact with them in ways that we find fit for ourselves, depending on our social needs for them. But like, who is the, or what, where does the responsibility lie mostly? Or is it a thing that needs collaborative between the big corporations and the consumer? Or yeah, like what would you say would be the solution to this?
I think you've already answered the question yourself. It's, you know, everybody is responsible. There are very many cynical moves made by big brands to push responsibility onto consumers, to shift the burden. Often it's called to make other people do the hard work of change while they just continue selling more products. And this is a very common tactic that big brands play in order to keep pursuing profit motives and profit goals. And yet I think that this is beginning to maybe be called out in a way that it wasn't before. Maybe one of the things I think is that we frequently in sort of systems change work, we try to talk to the change maker in everyone. And big brands, of course, are made up of individual people. And so trying to talk to the change agent, the change maker, potential change maker in everyone is a way to get every individual, whether you're a person who's buying and wearing or you're a person working in these brands, to foster change. Often the question that you've posed is also about, you know, what role for government in this? And in Europe at the moment, there is some new legislation that is going through, which is trying to really regulate in a complicated way, which is not necessarily beneficial for ecological issues because it's such a tricky area, but trying to regulate around sort of green consumption. And there's always an emphasis on governments doing that regulation. And I think that, I mean, I live in the UK and very complicatedly work in Scandinavia. And what I see is the difference between these two countries in terms of their appetite for government intervention is huge. I mean, the UK has no appetite for that at all, and Scandinavia positively calls for it, begs the governments to get involved. And I guess that's one of the things, is that the cultural appetite for intervention is massively different depending on where you are. And I'm sure you can say in South Africa, I'm sure it's different again. So the role that government plays, government has a profound role also for setting guardrails within which things happen. But generally in Europe, the focus is on growth at all costs. And so any changes that are put forward are all about just sort of surface dressing or polishing or slightly greening things, but nothing with profound change in mind.
Okay, thank you so much. You spoke about fashion trends, push for consumerism, and you also mentioned the color of the year. How much of an influence is that towards, consumerism in terms of fashion?
So I'm trying to recall I think it was last week that on average there's 25 drops into a fast fashion store in the UK every year. So that's a new drop every 2 weeks. I had in the past thought it was even sooner than that, but okay, so it seems now we're facing a situation of 25 drops. One of the things around aesthetics is that that's seen as a way to mark a difference. I mean, on the face of it, most of the stores that you go in seem to have exactly the same products as last year. Most of the time when I go in, I'm like, is there any difference? But structurally, as in the shape, the silhouette is a little different, but mainly similar. The main thing that seems to change are things like color and surface print. And I guess that is one of the key ways to begin to signal that there's a change. And if its sole goal is to drive sales to, which it is, I assume it's not about meeting needs, I guess, because needs are already met. I mean, in the UK, people are buying, how many is it? Something like 40 items of clothing a year. On average. It's not about that. So it is a driver amongst many other drivers. I wouldn't say it's the only one. Celebrity culture is a huge driver. Social media, a massive driver. Loads of different things are compelling people. But I also think that people find it very hard to imagine what fashion is beyond shopping for a new item. If you say, well, what else might fashion be? They're like, I don't know. It's hard to imagine other contexts. And I mean, even the etymology of the word fashion comes not anything to do with expanding access to goods through sort of industrial processes, but through making together in small groups. That was apparently the origin of the word fashion, making together in small groups. And now we've got fashion pretty much as shopping. And you see that it's been a very, very successful invention of a consumer model.
Thank you very much, Kate. My name is Caesar from Zimbabwe, and my question would be on the European countries that are then trying to push as much consumerism as they can for economic gains. Do we have any examples of countries that are trying to also bring in policies to bring it down? And if there's any that are like somewhat succeeding in any way? Because I think yeah, in a way, we actually need to also like just get to know or get to find solutions of how we can also like try and stop them. Because if we're trying to also come up with solutions down the line and we are the most affected, and yet they keep on pushing economic gains at whatever cost. I think it continues to be a vicious cycle. So I want to know if there are any that are starting to put stoppers and how those stoppers are also succeeding, so that maybe we can also maybe start thinking about influencing policies and local government scale here.
Yeah, what a good question. Thank you. So there are a few brands that are recognizing that they can't push through and exceed limits. I think I'm desperately trying to think of a large one, but I can only think of small brands that do that. And almost always what they do is they determine a maximum size past which they won't grow. And I don't know if they think of it in these terms, but in my head, it seems similar to what happens in ecosystems. So a species in an ecosystem will expand to fulfill the niche that it lives within. Once it has fulfilled that niche, it stops expanding and moves into a different phase of its life. And then it moves from growth and into maintenance. And I think the opportunities going forward are all going to be in understanding how to introduce a sense of up to this point and no further, and then figure out how to maintain businesses or opportunities and produce livelihoods and access to fashion provision and expression within a sort of maintenance model. I mean, that is the challenge. I guess that would be the challenge that's articulated within the degrowth movement as well. And it's also a set of, it's like a different sort of set of priorities. I think that there are very there's limited imagination being applied to that as a sort of a problem. And I guess part of that comes is that when you've been so steeped in this sort of view that fashion is about new products, 5 collections, 10, 25 collections a year, that sort of model, it's quite hard to imagine what else it might be. So it's almost like, you know, we were born with one particular sort of set of glasses on, and now we need to switch them for a new set of glasses and imagine what else the world can be. So we need, I mean, this is the opportunity for massive plural.
Maybe just in the microphone, because they don't know that we can't hear us.
Can you hear us? Can you hear us?
Kate, can you hear us? I don't think she can hear us.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Can you hear us?
Yeah, I can. Sorry, my headphones. I've not charged them for so long that I don't know what I was saying, but anyway, I think that's the. I think you were asking me about alternatives. Yeah. So yes, sorry, I lost my train of thought.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, does anybody else? I want to just ask them, but I don't have to. Do you want to ask them? Anybody else?
Yeah. This is more of a comment. I think it was really interesting when you were saying about these smaller brands catering to their niche markets. The company that I was talking about called Egg, they do that. It's very niche, it's very tailored, well, not tailored, but towards a certain market, basically. And sells other brands that are also, well, they're not even brands, it's more about makers, actually. And knowing the makers, you can go back to them if there's like a ribbon cardigan or something like that for, you know, vending and that sort of thing. But I think it takes like a lot of education for the consumers though, because these are such niche spaces and maybe not like hugely marketed either, you know. You might only learn about them if you manage to get into those spaces, you know. Like for myself, I only learned about that because I worked at that place, you know. So yeah, I wonder more about how to conscientize more people and sort of like get that into the mass. But also it's a bit tricky because it becomes a bit expensive. The pieces are actually quite pricey at the end of the day, you know, as well. Because it's more like buying an S.
I mean, I'm glad you raised price because this is a really important question, I think, and I didn't mention it, and I think it is often weaponized in this sort of debate, discussion, movement of change. And often it's a justification for no change, that fast fashion is relatively inexpensive. And so people, for example, I've heard the CEO of H&M justifying the existence of fast fashion on the back of it being a democratic process. And I hear that and I just think it's not, there's nothing democratic about it. If it was really democratic, it would be giving people control over the means of production. I mean, it just doesn't at all. It's giving people a very narrow choice of pre-described items to buy. But the point is, I suppose, is that more people now can access more goods if they want it. But this is also part of the whole creating a narrative around the unquestionability of fast fashion as a model. One of the other things that is really important, and I didn't mention it either within this whole picture, is that fast fashion, which is a business model, that's what it is. It's a business model based on selling high volume at low price, a business model, which has been created, and other, of course, many others exist, others can be created too. But the fast fashion business model has been enabled massively by the fossil fuel industry, by the increasing use of synthetic fibers. So it's no coincidence that synthetic fibers have increased massively in their consumption as fast fashion has, because one of the things that the oil companies have on record admitted to is that now they are looking for new markets for oil, and they are shifting their focus onto plastics, including textiles, to make into clothing. So what we've seen over this last period of time is that the price of clothes has been reduced significantly. So consumption has gone up by 25% as the price of clothing has gone down by 20%. I mean, it's sort of obvious what's going on, and that's been entirely enabled by the production and introduction into the market of synthetic fibers, notably polyester. So this relationship now that we've got between low price, synthetic fibers, climate change. I know it's not a simple relationship between synthetic fibers and climate change, and natural fibers also make impact, and now microplastic pollution, which seems like off the scale. And now the new idea of circular economy, not new, but idea of basically circular economy, or in other words, recycling as a way to fix this problem and that it's just going to go round and round and round, but faster or something. It's all sort of caught together in a really complicated web that I guess that when you begin to unravel it, you see the role of particular vested interests and power plays and other things. And so I guess the challenge is, it's true that many items that are marketed as sustainable have a high price point. And it's possible that we could all ask the question in that time, is it's not that those items are necessarily too expensive, it's that everything else is just too cheap. That's been undermining our expectations of how much clothes should cost and what their value is accordingly. I mean, famously, you know, people say, you know, price is part of the design. If you set a high price point, people will appreciate it, or, you know, it's part of its quality. And I guess that this is part of the thing. And then just a last anecdote on that story. So Marks and Spencer's, who I'm sure there are some Marks and Spencer's in South Africa, but it's famously is this big sort of British retailer, this big British retailer who were producing socks, ethical socks in a factory, and they were labeling the socks from this factory as ethical, but these socks were also made in the same factory as all of the other socks that M&S made. M&S made all its socks in the same factory, which was an ethical factory. But consumers in the UK thought that ethical socks would be more expensive. So Marks and Spencer's could put a price premium on some of them, and they labeled them as ethical, and then managed to get a price premium for that small group, for those people who were willing to pay that extra bit. And everything else was ethical, produced in exactly the same way, but just labeled as regular socks. And here you can see that feels really cynical about Marks and Spencer just trying to just cream off a bit more profit. But it also is an insight into what certain groups of consumers expect. It's an expectations reveal really around some of the behavior in this area.
Mine is really a question. It's just last year I went to a company called Uniqlo. I don't know if it's the but it's quite a big European brand, and they've got a sustainability policy on recycling, which ensures that every of their packaging carries a sticker that says you can use the same bag, put your old clothes from Uniqlo, which they will clean up and then send out for humanitarian purposes. But they can also resell, and they can also use some components of the clothes for as energy in a way of reducing CO2 emissions. And I found that quite a very good step in terms of just promoting environmental and positive environmental policies, but also encouraging consumers not to throw away their clothes and maintain the movements, but at the same time being very conscious of the environment.
So I could barely hear the question because the sound was going in and out. I heard Uniqlo, and is that right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Do you want to just repeat it?
Could you just praise the key points again? Sorry.
Okay, no, I was only highlighting an experience that I had with Uniqlo, that it has put in place a policy, sustainability policy around recycling of old clothes that have been bought by their customers. So on every packaging that they put out, they've got a big sticker that you can use the same bag at postage free cost to send back these clothes to them, so that they can actually fill them up and sell them for material purposes, or also resell or use some components of their clothes for energy purposes. So I just found that quite a very good policy in terms of just environmental policy and just all the environment.
Oh. Another really good question. I feel like you've been planted in order for me to explain a little more about my presentation. So brilliant. So what you've given there is an example of like a business model innovation that Uniqlo seemed to be investing in. I didn't know they did that. Maybe they don't do that in Europe. Maybe they do. I didn't know that. And it's so interesting to see the endless ways that people are attempting, and there are so many good attempts that people are making to foster change. What I would say is I think that that notions like the circular economy, their starting point is the assumption that you can close a loop with clothing, that it is actually a closed loop. And I would say that it isn't. It's an open it's an open loop because you sell things to people and then they go in someone's drawer, under the bed, they get like thrown out the window, I don't know, buried in the garden. It's not closed. It's not a closed loop. However, what you're describing is an attempt from this brand to get people to send the item or an old item back so that it can re-enter the system. And at the moment, that's one of the problems, is that nobody knows how to access all of this very dispersed stuff that's around and put it back into the system. I mean, there are many things to say about the circular economy, but including that it doesn't take account of people, which is a massive, massive problem with it. And maybe also that it doesn't recognize the laws of thermodynamics, that every system moves from a state of order to disorder. I mean, it's an open system. So it is trying to do something that I think is largely impossible. And I think would probably be better for us to sort of acknowledge its limitations and maybe to work with that. But another anecdote on your point, I mean, I think it is good that people are attempting to get this valuable stuff, these fibers, this fabric back into the system. At the moment, we don't really have the technologies to be recycling these materials when they come back into another textile. Most of the time, the vast majority of time, for synthetic fibers, they get downcycled to low value end uses like stuffing material or insulation or other purposes. They don't get reused they don't get remade into high value textiles. And so this sort of half-baked notion that in a circular economy you would have a garment, it would go back to a factory and then be remade into a garment and go round is not reality at the moment. And then another one of the things about this sort of business model innovation that people are doing, so Marks and Spencer's, again, that same company I mentioned before, they had a scheme in store, and I know that other brands like H&M and other places do this too, where you have a sort of bin that as a shopper you can go in with a bag of old clothes that you no longer want and you can put them into this bin. And when you did that, originally Marks and Spencer's would give you a voucher for money off for new items, and I know that other brands do that too. And then Marks and Spencer then were doing a study of the baskets of people who had this voucher. And when people came into the store with something to drop off and then went shopping for new things, they bought far more than just a regular shopper. And so Marks and Spencer saw this as a way of enticing people in to spend more. The psychology, I guess, is that you feel a bit lighter, you've got rid of something, so now you can just, you can just go crazy. And that is a really common ploy, that it's seen as a way to keep in contact with people and to get people open and available to spend more than they would ordinarily.
I think we're going to wrap it up because we are out of time, but Kate, this has been really amazing and such a perfect way to close off our day of discussions. Thank you so much for being so generous with your time and joining us. And yeah, we hope to keep in touch.
Absolutely. Good luck, everybody. Thank you. Goodbye.
I'll be in touch soon.
Yeah, wonderful. Bye-bye.
Thank you.